Shri Chinmaya Sadgurave Namaha. Hari Om. The topic for this session, Champion You, is women in leadership. So in order to think about this topic, we will try and answer a few questions that hopefully will shed some light on this thought. The first question is, why are we asking this question? Why are we thinking about this topic? How is it relevant? The second, is there a difference between male and female leadership such that we need to think about women specifically in leadership? Who can we understand as a leader? What prevents us from being able to lead? And what, if anything, is required in order for us to become true leaders? So the first question is, why are we thinking about this topic in particular? What we find is that very often women in whichever field have this question about leadership. And we see that when we think about how people view leaders and also how they view traditionally gender roles, whether that's male or female, then very often our idea of a leader lines up more closely with our idea of masculine traits than it does with feminine traits. So when we think who is a leader, then some examples may come to mind, and also particular traits come to mind. Those traits, if we think about what we associate them with, then very often we find that we associate them with masculinity rather than femininity. And therefore this question arises for women that, can we, as women, staying true to who we are, be leaders and be viewed as leaders in society or at work, wherever it may be? Or do we have to adopt particular traits in order to be viewed as leaders? Whether that's as a result of external views of who we are and who we should be, or sometimes also because we have internalized those views of society about what a woman should be and what a woman should not be. So this is where the question comes from, really. Now, is there any difference between male leadership and female leadership? So if we set aside the question of leadership just for a moment, and we think about traits, masculine traits and feminine traits, and how they are traditionally perceived, then what we find is there is a difference between the two. So, for example, in our scriptures, we find reference to the idea of pumstvam. Pumstvam, not physical maleness, but pumstvam implying the idea of rational, logical, analytical thinking, discernment, the spirit of detachment, which is there pointed out in that context as a quality that is necessary for the spiritual seeker. If we put that together with someone who is in a leadership position, then that will result in someone who, again, is thinking very rationally, someone who perhaps is more result-oriented, is very focused on the goal, someone who has a more authoritarian style of leadership, who is expecting others to follow them and sometimes to follow them without question. This or these are some ideas which are associated with masculine traits and therefore with male leadership. On the other hand, if we think of feminine traits, there is a difference that we can identify. So whereas masculinity implies logical thinking, femininity implies more emotive thinking. It implies a person who is more compassionate, who is more caring, and who in their leadership is more inclusive or democratic compared to the earlier authoritarian style of leadership. And particular feminine traits being compassion, firmness, constancy, memory, intelligence, as pointed out also in the Bhagavad Gita, those positive, laudable traits of fame, of wealth, prosperity, of good speech, etc. So we do find a difference in the traits, and therefore if we extend that into leadership, we may identify a difference between what is traditionally perceived as male leadership versus what is perceived as more female type of leadership. What we find, if we refer back to the Bhagavad Gita, there is a question of who is a leader. So there, Bhagavan Sri Krishna, when he is speaking to Arjuna, he makes reference to Shrestha. Shrestha meaning an exemplary person, the best kind of person. That person becomes a leader because whatever they do, others follow. Others follow them, one, in their behavior, but also in their thinking. So whatever that leader thinks, and whatever they accept as an authority, others will also accept as the authority, as well as doing what they do. In addition, Bhagavan Sri Krishna mentions that the leader is someone who leads by example, who will not say, do what I say and not as I do, but who will act in a way that sets an example for others, who will act in a way that demonstrates what are all the ideal qualities that are to be cultivated and developed, what are the ideal habits, the ideal behaviors, so that others can see that example before them and feel inspired to and actually follow what that leader is doing. In addition, if that leader knows that people are walking on a particular path and that path is suited to them, it is where they will be able to grow and to evolve, then that leader should not cause doubt in the minds of those who are following. In fact, that leader should encourage people to do their best and to get involved, because that is the way that they themselves will be able to evolve, and the leader is one who helps them to do so. What we also find is, from this discussion of leadership, that even if we are not in a formal leadership role, each of us is an example to somebody. As mothers, we may be an example to children. As elder sisters, we are an example to younger siblings. As aunts or grandmothers or cousins or friends, we are providing an example, whether we know it or not, to someone or the other. Someone is looking at us, observing how we think and how we behave, and is modeling some aspect of their thinking or behavior on us. And that means that each of us actually is already a leader. Maybe not formally, maybe not to everybody, but to someone or the other in our life, we are providing that example. And there, it's not because we have adopted particular masculine traits or feminine traits. It's just because we are in that position to provide a good example to others. This is one thing that we can see from that discussion. Another point is, when Bhagavan Sri Krishna first speaks to Arjuna, one of the first things that he says to him in that conversation is, Klaibhyam mas magaha. Do not yield to impotence. This is how we generally will translate this. What does it mean when he says, do not yield to impotence? what Arjuna is doing, how he is thinking and behaving in that situation, is he is without clarity, he is under pressure internally, and he is unable to see a way forward. Klebium is translated as impotence, and it also means a rejection or that which is free from both masculine and feminine. Arjuna is someone who had lived as a man, but also who had lived as 1 year for a woman. The reason that he is in that situation, where he is unable to stand up as a leader, where he is confused, where he is unable to act, is because he has rejected, or he is suppressing part of himself which knows what is right. Maybe not actively, not consciously, but his mind is interfering with the knowledge in his intellect, which is very clear about what is right and wrong. So what we find is that Arjuna, who is perhaps someone who we would identify as a natural leader, comes into this situation where he is unable to fulfill that role because he has this internal conflict. Because he is not integrated within himself. And therefore, in the continuation of that conversation, Bhagavan at various points speaks about the integrated personality as one which is best suited for living in the world and best suited to progress in our spiritual journey also. Our mind, which is the seat of our likes and dislikes, our preferences, our emotions, that mind should, ideally, what we want is for it to be working with our intellect, the seat of our knowledge, our understanding. If there is internal conflict, that conflict will become manifest externally. It's not about particular traits, it's about, are we integrated within ourselves? Are we at peace within? Because if we are integrated within, if we have allowed that mind to be relieved of the burden of strong preferences, likes and dislikes, by doing our duty in the best possible way with the right attitude, then that mind can follow the educated intellect. Then the personality becomes integrated, and then, most importantly, even more than becoming leaders in the world, in community, in society, we are able to take charge of our own life. We are able to do our best, to be our best, and to live in the best possible way. What's required is not the adoption of particular traits. What's required is the integration of the personality. And what we find is that when we are able to recognize whatever talents and abilities already exist within us, and we allow those to come into expression, then we are in a position where we can lead, because we are not suppressing anything within ourselves. If we reject a positive part of our personality for fear of how it's perceived by others, we will lose out. There is an interesting story in the Srimad Bhagavatam of Sudyumna, a king who ventures into a particular forest. And for anyone who ventures into that forest, what happens is they have to turn into the opposite gender, or they turn into women. So Dyumna, along with his retinue, they come into the forest and they are all turned into women. So Dyumna then, after some time, because of something else which happens, he ends up living 1 month as a man and 1 month as a woman. As a king, he is very comfortable living with his subjects as a man, because that's how they know him. But when he has to live that 1 month as a woman, every alternate month, he finds, or he feels, that he has to hide away. He can't come in front of everybody and live openly. And because of that, his subjects are unable to trust him. They lose their faith in him, and he is unable to lead successfully. So, in terms of this question of, do we have to be a particular way to be leaders? We don't have to be a particular way in terms of external expectations. But the most effective leader, as we see in the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita, is one who is Shrestha. And Shrestha because they are able to themselves live in the best way and think in the best way. And they are able to do so because they have removed whatever internal conflict exists within them. So for women in leadership, what does this mean? One point is, as we saw earlier, we may identify differences in masculine traits and feminine traits. We may see that traditionally roles are more associated with masculinity or femininity. For example, in the corporate field, we find that roles such as those of human resources are more typically considered as feminine roles because their job is to look after everyone, to be compassionate, to be caring. In the corporate field again, but externally, we have this idea of corporate social responsibility, which is driven by the motivation to give back to society as much as, or even more than, the resources that have been taken from that society. So companies identify ways in which they can contribute back to society. On the other hand, traditionally male roles are seen as something different, not necessarily associated with those characteristics of compassion or of caring. However, we also see that it is very clear that women are capable of leadership, that we are already leaders. And therefore, what is required is not for us to change who we are, is not for us to try and be something that we are not, but in fact to be more ourselves, to tap into whatever potentials, whatever resources we already have, but to do so in a way that by creating harmony internally, we are able to function more efficiently externally, and then, if required, as needed, we are able to take up leadership roles in the community, in society, in our careers, without any doubt about whether it is possible, whether it can happen, without allowing external expectations to prevent us from fulfilling our potential and doing our best in the world. Hari Om. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om. Shri Guru Pyo Namaha. Hari Om.